So having studied the two types of elasticities of demand, those being income elasticity of demand and price elasticity of demand, we'll now move on to study the third type of elasticity of demand, and that would be cross elasticity of demand. So we have got XED or cross elasticity of demand. Again, we'd be looking at the four things that we said that we have to study for any type of elasticity of demand. Those four things being the definition, the formula, the interpretation of sign, and the interpretation of magnitude. Okay. So definition, how would we modify the definition? It is a measure of responsiveness of quantity demanded of a product to a change in, instead of income that we had for YED, we will now have to a change in price of another product. Okay. Again, cross elasticity of demand, the definition would be it is the measure of responsiveness of quantity demanded of a product to a change in price of another product. So we have got product A, its price changes, and as a result of that, the quantity demanded of product B changes. Let's first look at the formula and then we'll discuss a few practical examples. So the formula will become XED is equal to percentage change in quantity demanded of product A divided by percentage change in price of product B. Okay, so the examples that we will discuss are, for example, first of all, we have got tea and sugar. Okay, so we know that usually sugar is consumed with tea. People like to taste sugar with tea. Okay, so how would the change in price of one product affect the demand for another product? So let's assume that the price of tea rises. The price of tea rises. Price for tea. What would happen as a result? The quantity demanded of tea will fall. Okay, but we are not at the moment looking at the quantity demanded of tea. What about the demand for sugar? What about the demand for sugar? The demand for sugar will fall. Why? Because tea has become more expensive. People have now started using less quantities of tea, and as a result of that, since sugar was consumed with tea, the the demand for sugar will decline. Similarly, we have got another set of products. Let's say tea and coffee. Tea and coffee. So how would this play out if the price for tea rises? If the price for tea rises, the demand for coffee will rise. The demand for coffee will rise. Why? Because people will now switch from consuming tea to another substitute, that is coffee. Okay, now this relationship may either be strong or it may be weak. For example, it might be that tea and coffee, yes, they are substitutes for each other, but for certain people, what would happen that regardless of the rise in the price of tea, the demand for coffee will not rise as much, and vice versa. So in that case, we would have a low value of XED. And similarly, it could be for the tea and sugar as well. For example, the price of one rises and the price of tea rises and the demand for sugar does not fall as much. In that case, we will have a low magnitude for XED. So the quantity of the number of magnitude, it actually tells us how strong the relationship is. And when we'll discuss the point number 4 in our model, we'll discuss this in more detail over there. So this gives us two types of goods which are related to each other. The first type would be complements. The first type of goods which are related to each other, it would be complements, and the second set of goods would be substitutes. Okay, we can also modify the definition a bit. The cross elasticity of demand for a product is the measure of responsiveness of quantity demanded of a product to a change in price of, instead of we can say another product, we can also say of a related product. Okay, so how do we define complements and substitutes? Complements are the goods which are in joint demand, which are used together, and substitutes are the goods which are used in place of each other. Okay, moving on, the interpretation of sign. If you could pause the video for a second and think for your own self, when will we just have the positive sign? Will we just have the negative sign for XED? Or it could be either of the two, and when will we have positive or when will we have negative sign? So if you have thought about it for a second, the positive sign would be when there is both a positive value in the numerator and a positive value in the denominator, or if you have got a negative value in the numerator as well as a negative value in the denominator. So that happens in the case of substitutes. For example, the price of tea, if there is a positive change in it, there would be a positive change in the substitute of tea. The demand for coffee will also rise. Similarly, when tea becomes less expensive, its price falls, people will now switch from coffee to tea and the demand for coffee will rise. So for positive, we will have a positive answer, and for negative and negative, we will again have a positive answer. So that is when the answer for XED is positive. Cross elasticity of demand is positive for substitutes. Let's say it would be for substitutes. So whenever we have got positive answer for XED for two goods, we can say that they are substitutes of each other. So that leaves us with the negative sign, and automatically we can now infer that the negative sign would be for complements. But let's also see the dynamics of it. So for example, if price of tea rises, the demand for sugar which is used with tea will fall. Similarly, when the price of tea falls, people will now consume more tea, and as a result of that, they'll also demand sugar more. So the demand for sugar will rise. So again, for a positive change in price, we've got a negative change in demand, and for a negative change in price, we've got a positive change in demand. In both cases, the answer will be negative. And this would be the case for complementary goods or complements. Okay, this is a bit tricky. You might have to go through this a couple of times, but I think that I've explained in sufficient detail. If you go through it again and again, eventually you'll be able to understand this concept. Let's move on to point number 4, which would be the interpretation of magnitude. So instead of YED, we will have the XEDs. XED equal to 0, XED less than 1, XED is equal to 1, XED is more than 1, and XED is infinity. Okay, yes. So now when we give examples, for example, for substitute goods or complementary goods, some student they raise the question that, sir, for us the demand will not rise or fall by by that much for a change in price of the other good. So as I said earlier, that shows a weak relationship, that the XED in that case will be less than 1. If the goods are totally unrelated, if the change in price of one does not affect the quantity demanded or the demand for the other product at all, then they would be perfectly inelastic, or there would be the value of 0. The price the change of price and for one good would not affect the demand for another product, so the XED will be 0. The goods, they may have a unitary relationship or a elastic relationship as well. For example, when the change in price of one causes more than proportionate change in the demand for the other product. For example, the price of tea rises by 5% and the demand for sugar falls by more than 5%. Or if the price of tea falls by if the price for tea falls by 5% and the demand for the price of tea falls by 5% and the demand for coffee rises by more than 5%. So yes, in that case will be, in that case we will have an elastic relationship. So that sums up the four types and the three types of elasticities: the price elasticity of demand, the income elasticity of demand, and the cross elasticity of demand that we have to study.